Okay, again, you're at Landscaping with Natives, maximizing the ecological value of your landscape. Coralie is presenting tonight. Coralie, she is the chair of the INPS Landscaping with Natives team. So she leads a group of great people who are designers and ecologists who provide resources for landscaping with natives in Indiana. So Coralie is originally from London, where she received her bachelor's and her master's degree in biological sciences from Oxford University. Since moving to Indiana 9 years ago, she has spent time studying the native plants and ecology of the Midwest, which has become a passion for her. Coralie, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video and turn it over to you right now.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Brooke. So thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity to speak with you all. So firstly, just a brief overview of what I'll be covering. I'm just going to go over some of the background on the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem function and why it's so important that we landscape with native plants and try to incorporate ecological practices into our gardening. Then just a bit of an exploration of some of the key concepts for maximizing the ecological value of our landscape. So controlling invasives, reducing lawn areas, species selection, and ecological landscape management. And some details on how you can incorporate these ideas to build your own wildlife habitat here in Indiana. And lastly, I'll just give a quick outline of some of the work that the INPS Landscaping with Natives team is doing, the resources that we're working to make available, and some opportunities for you to get involved. Also, I just wanted to note that the photos used in the presentation were all taken in my average sized suburban garden here in central Indiana. So you really don't need a lot of land to be able to create some really valuable habitat. So first up, why are native plants so important? And it really boils down to this key concept, biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of life in a given place. There are four main ways to measure biodiversity. So species richness, which is the total number of species within an area. Genetic diversity, which is the variety of genetic information within a population, a species, or a community. Endemic species, which are the species that occur in that area and nowhere else. And ecosystem diversity, so the total number of ecosystems in a given area. But unfortunately, whichever one of those you consider, the situation with regards to biodiversity really isn't looking great. Research from a very broad geographic range and across different species indicates a very clear trend. So biodiversity is in steep decline. The global assessment published in 2019 found that biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. This assessment, with more than 350 contributing authors, analyzed more than 15,000 scientific publications, as well as a large body of indigenous and local knowledge, and it covered all regions of the world. The assessment found that around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades. As with climate change, humans are the main culprit in biodiversity loss, and the report found that 75% of the terrestrial environment is severely altered by human actions. The assessment also reported that the current rate of global species extinction is tens to hundreds of times greater than the average over the last 10 million years. And very worryingly, this rate is accelerating. Meanwhile, a 2020 report by the Worldwide Fund for Nature found that global populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish have suffered an average 2/3 decline in less than half a century, with an alarming average drop of 68% since 1970. So insect abundance, biomass, species richness, and range size are all declining. The number of insects has been reduced around 45% since 1974, while reported annual rates of decline in abundance are estimated to be between 1% to 2%. Insects are vital to life as we know it. They pollinate 90% of all flowering plants, and they're the primary means by which energy is transferred from plants to most other animals and food webs. They also play major roles in the critical processes of decomposition and of nutrient cycling. Meanwhile, here in the US, a 2019 assessment found staggering losses in the North American bird population, with an estimated net loss of 2.9 billion breeding adults since 1970. So devastating losses were found among birds in every biome. More than 90% of the losses, or more than 2.5 billion birds, were from just 12 families, including the sparrows, blackbirds, warblers, and finches. The population losses included many widespread and common species that may be disproportionately influential components of food webs and ecosystem function. So biodiversity is in decline, but what does that mean for us? And does it really matter? And the short answer is yes, it matters an awful lot. The loss of biodiversity affects us all. So a reduction in genetic diversity affects species' potential for adaptation, for ongoing evolution and survival. And this is becoming even more critical as fragile populations face increased pressures from climate change and loss of habitat through rapid development. Loss of individuals is in itself a tragedy, and loss of abundance of individuals can lead to species extinctions. Loss of each unique and intrinsically valuable species is irreparable, and each species lost increases the risk of cascading effects. So with the loss of interdependent species and the breakdown and loss of entire ecosystems. And this is really, really important. So ecosystems are incredibly complex. We have limited understanding of even the most well-studied species interactions, and there are countless others that we have little to no knowledge of at all. We just don't know where the breaking point for ecosystems are. So when we lose biodiversity, we destabilize these systems and we risk their collapse. And without functioning ecosystems, we lose the vital ecosystem services which support life, such as the provision of oxygen, food, and fresh water. So for many of us, the conservation of other species is in itself a strong enough argument for action. But even for those who perhaps aren't as concerned with the conservation of other species, we can also look at it from a very anthropocentric view. The loss of functioning ecosystems impacts not only our quality of life, but also threatens the very existence of life on Earth. Humans are completely dependent on the ecosystem services provided by plants and animals, and biodiversity is critical for ensuring the stability of ecosystems that provide these services. And this is rather brilliantly and succinctly described in E.O. Wilson's 1987 paper, The Little Things That Run the World, in which he states, "If invertebrates were to disappear, I doubt that the human species could last for more than a few months." So the conservation of biodiversity really is critical. So in his wonderful Half-Earth, E.O. Wilson argues that time is running short and we need to quickly act to stabilize the biosphere. He put forward the argument that by saving or setting aside as a natural reserve half of the Earth, we could stabilize 80% of its species. And that is an amazing goal and something that is wonderful to strive towards. There is a growing understanding that the biodiversity crisis needs to be addressed at a global level and with the same urgency as the climate crisis. Just this last week, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's COP15 meeting discussed the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework comprises 21 targets and 10 milestones proposed for 2030, en route to living in harmony with nature by 2050. Key targets include, among other things, conserving and protecting at least 30% of the Earth's lands and oceans by 2030. It's a global conservation initiative known as 30 by 30. However, unfortunately, the US is one of a very small handful of countries that's not a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And even though the vast majority of countries, some 196, are signatories, achieving these goals, especially with unpredictable and changing political will, can sometimes seem distant and potentially unattainable. And so this is really where all of us come in. So I know many of you might be familiar with Dr. Doug Tallamy's excellent work. And his approach, the Homegrown National Park idea, takes the teachings of E.O. Wilson and others and looks at how we can achieve their goals within the constraints of the world we actually find ourselves in. So looking at the situation as it is today, where, for example, in the US, most land is under private ownership, Dr. Tallamy doesn't diminish the critical role of public preserves, but he argues that on their own, they will not be enough to sustain biodiversity. He argues that we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. In doing so, he expands both the opportunity and the responsibility for this necessary task of restoring ecological function to the land to all of us. And this is where native plants come in, because one of the main ways to do that is to use native plants in our landscaping. So native plant communities support a great deal more biodiversity than introduced plants. So those who know Dr. Talamir's work will know, as he explains it so well, this is mainly due to specialized relationships that have evolved between plants and insects. And that's driven largely by the evolution of plant defenses to herbivory and insect adaptations to these. Around 90% of insect herbivores are diet or host plant specialists, meaning that they can only eat or live on plants that they have developed a relationship with through evolutionary time. So while introduced plants can provide some ecosystem functions, there is almost always a loss in biodiversity when they're used in place of native plants. And again, for all of you who are familiar with Dr. Talamir's work, you'll know it's largely about the caterpillars. So figures from 2 studies really illustrate this very clearly. One 2018 study found that there were 68% fewer caterpillar species, 91% fewer caterpillars, and 96% less caterpillar biomass in study areas with introduced plants compared to native hedgerows. Another study found that suburban yards dominated by introduced plants was 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees compared to primarily native landscapes. So hopefully that helps to explain some of the reasons why it's so critical that we start to view our gardens as habitat and why landscaping with native plants is so important. And I think what's so encouraging is that, as Dr. Talamir states, the Homegrown National Park concept really empowers each of us and shrinks the problem to something that might be manageable. With so many environmental concerns worldwide and so many of our plant and wildlife populations declining and facing increasing threats, using our diverse native plants in landscaping is a way we could all do something and actually really make a big difference. But it can sometimes seem a little daunting or a little unclear how to actually do this. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of the main considerations and key concepts that can really increase the ecological value of your landscape and the native plantings. So one of the really critical first steps is to identify and remove any invasive species. Invasive species are defined as non-native species whose introduction causes or may cause economic or environmental harm to human health. So they're one of the greatest threats to natural habitats and are responsible for degrading and destroying thousands of acres of natural plant communities in Indiana. They displace native plants, eliminate food and cover for wildlife, and threaten rare plant and animal species. Control efforts for these invasive species are costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. In some areas of the state, it's been estimated that over 80% of woody invasive species, such as Asian bush honeysuckle, privet, and burning bush, come from landscape plantings. And unfortunately, some of the worst invasive plants are still being sold by nurseries. So you certainly want to remove any species listed in the terrestrial plant rule, and really also any that are designed as invasive by the Invasive Plant Advisory Committee. There is a great field guide, the Pocket Guide to Regulated Plants, which has photos and descriptions to identify the plants and information on how to tell them apart from similar looking natives. And you can download a PDF of that from the INPS website. The INPS website also has excellent resources on invasives, including downloadable brochures, lists of invasive-free growers under their Grow Indiana Natives program, suggestions for native alternatives to commonly used invasive species, and videos on invasive removal techniques on the YouTube channel, thanks to Wendy Ford and Sarah Gray. There's also some wonderful information available through the Indiana Invasives Initiative and the local cooperative invasive species management areas, so SISMAs, such as MC Iris. And I can share all of the links for these resources with Brooke, so she can get those out to you. And then the next consideration is really the area that you can plant in and add native plants to. So really, the greater the area, the better. Adding native plants to existing beds and borders is wonderful, but also if you're able to reduce your lawn, which is an area that is really ecologically not very valuable, by any amount, that's incredibly helpful. Dr. Talamir in the Homegrown National Park call to action is aiming for 20 million acres of native planting in the US. It's the largest cooperative conservation effort ever conceived or attempted, and represents the area of approximately half of the green lawns of privately owned properties in the US. So whether you're able to fully cut your lawn in half or just extend your planted area by a few feet, any amount can make a difference. You can also register your land by zip code on the Homegrown National Park website, which is a really great way to be inspired and see the Homegrown National Park growing in your local area. And then the next big decision is what to plant. And species selection can make a really very big difference. Species selection will influence the aesthetics, the maintenance, and the ecological value of your habitat. So recent research indicates that a few genera are really critical for local ecosystems, going above and beyond in terms of ecological productivity. One 2020 study, which included over 12,000 butterfly and moth species and more than 2,000 native plant genera, found that on average across the US counties sampled, just 14% of local plant genera support more than 90% of Lepidoptera diversity. And the difference between the productivity of these keystone plants and other genera is huge. Keystone genera support orders of magnitude more Lepidoptera species than the majority of other local plants. So the research really indicates that not all native plants are equivalent in terms of their contributions of energy flow through food webs and their support of interaction diversity. So planting the keystone native plants will have a disproportionately large impact on restoring biodiversity through the trophic levels and will really help to create the most productive landscapes possible. So 10 woody plant genera were identified as outliers due to their disproportionately high values across all counties analysed. So these are the 10 kind of superstars. And in 84% of counties in which they occur in North America, an oak is the most powerful plant to plant. And then the list here, so it's the oaks, the willows, cherries, plums and peaches, the pines, poplars, aspens and cottonwoods, birch, cranberry and blueberry, hickories, maples, and then apples and crab apples. And helpfully there is an excellent plant finder tool developed by the National Wildlife Federation in collaboration with Dr. Talamy. And you can put in your zip code and search for the highest value genera to Lepidoptera in your area by zip code. So the results rank the top genera in each category, so flowers and grasses, and then trees and shrubs. And for my zip code here in central Indiana, the top 10 herbaceous plants come out as the goldenrods, the sunflowers, strawberries, bonesets and joe pye weeds, the violets, geranium, water parsnips, hibiscus and rose mallows, panic grass, and ironweed. So those keystone plants support very high numbers of Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths, and so they support species richness throughout the trophic levels. But the intention isn't to limit or restrict your plantings to just these. Ideally, you want to increase plant diversity overall with the intentional inclusion of these keystone plants. So ideally, these keystone genera will form the backbone of your plantings. And then the next big consideration, I think, is then to look at what best supports some of our other invertebrates and other pollinators. And I find it easiest to break this down into two main areas. So first of all, planting for specialists and increasing diversity at the family and genus levels. And then secondly, planting for successional blooming. So planting for specialists. Planting for specialists can really greatly increase the biodiversity supported by the habitat, as both specialist and generalist species can be supported. So many of our native bees specialize on a particular plant family or genus when gathering pollen. Less commonly, some appear to specialize on just a single species. So including plants from the genera that typically support the most specialists, together with the greatest diversity of native plants, particularly at the family level, is a really strong strategy for trying to increase the ecological value of your landscape. So Heather Home calls these plants that really play an important role in providing food, shelter, and nesting sites the powerhouse plants. And she has excellent free downloadable resources and plant lists on her website, which is pollinatorsnativeplants.com. and then particularly for native bees and wasps. And the Xerxes Society also provide great information on endangered pollinators and on planting for pollinators. And then flowering phenology, so ensuring that you're planting so you have a successional blooming period from and floral resources for as long a season as you possibly can. So from early spring right through late fall. So in the spring in particular, this can be some of the woody species. We're really lucky here in Indiana to have some of the few remaining populations of rusty patch bumblebees. And so considering floral resources that will support populations such as these, particularly early in the spring, is really important. Later spring and summer tend to bring a bounty of blooms, and then through into late autumn, try to consider adding late blooming species, such as some of the goldenrods and asters, which can be a lifeline for those creatures preparing for migration or for overwintering. So I realize that's a lot of information, so just to summarize, so including keystone plants is critical for increasing the ecological value of plantings. Including both plants that support high numbers of Lepidoptera and those that support specialist pollinators is key. Additionally, those that have either a long bloom time or provide floral resources early or late in the season, and those that provide nesting and sheltering sites can be of very high value. And then you want to look at that list and add in as much diversity as you can, particularly at the family level and the genus level, as this really increases the potential support for as many specialists as possible. And it might have quite significant positive impact on some of the populations that specialize on some of the less commonly used plants. So those guidelines can give you a great idea of which plant families and genera will make the biggest ecological impact. And then a good next step is to work out which species within those genera are native to your area. And there are a couple of really great tools to do this. So we are very excited that a collaboration between the Indiana Native Plant Society and the Indiana Wildlife Federation has produced a truly excellent local plant finder tool. This is brand new, it was just launched a few months ago. This tool was made possible thanks to the incredible work of Ellen Jackart and Wendy Ford over the years developing such a comprehensive database of information, and for incredibly generously sharing this with the Indiana Wildlife Federation. So IWF were able to use a donation for the rebuild of their website recently, and the data from INPS has enabled them to build this plant finder tool. I think it's really an excellent addition, as I think it's one of the only plant finder tools that that will let you combine ecological data with landscaping information. So you can filter results by light and water levels, color, bloom period, pollinators, and plant height. And wonderfully for us, all of the species in this tool are native to Indiana, so there is no cross-referencing with range maps required. And yeah, so the website for that is up there, and it is in progress. There are still photos being added, but there is a lot of information already up and running on that site. So the other great resource, if you want to look at the county level, is the Biota of North America program. Their North American Plant Atlas gives US county level species maps, which are really very comprehensive. You can search by genus and see all of the species in that genus that are native to your county. So this is a really detailed resource for those wanting to delve just a little bit deeper. And then it also might be a consideration to prioritize some of the less common species or those that are of conservation concern here in Indiana, in order to support the wildlife that depends on these fragile remaining populations. And the DNR have some good lists of species of conservation concern up on their website. So these considerations can really help guide you to the species that will make the biggest impact. And then the excellent resources on the landscaping section of the INPS website can really help you to match the species with your site conditions and with your landscaping goals. So we have hundreds of wonderful native plants here in Indiana, and choosing the ones to best suit your conditions and spaces will really help to make your habitats both ecologically valuable and enjoyable. So where possible, echoing native plant communities, so assessing what plant community your property or area resembles, such as a woodland, a water's edge, or a prairie, together with the conditions, so the soil, the light, the aspect, and the moisture level, is an excellent approach. And we have some great resources on the INPS website listing species that would be found in natural communities in various conditions. For other areas of your landscaping, ecological value can still be a primary consideration, but form or function, such as a screening biohedge or a rain garden, or aesthetics might be also high on your list of priorities. And then thinking about maintenance is also really key. We do focus quite a lot on landscaping with herbaceous plants, but adding native trees and shrubs to your landscapes can be a really wonderful way to greatly increase the ecological value of your habitat while keeping maintenance time and costs really very low. And again, Heather Home has some excellent resources on this and on the vertical value of native trees and on her website. So the wonderful thing about landscaping with native plants is that they can fill both roles. You can have any design or aesthetic and also be ecologically very important. We have our wonderful tall grass prairie plants that look majestic in larger spaces, but we also have a lot of native plant species that are smaller in stature or maybe better suited to more formal landscaping areas. Additionally, there are design tools and management techniques that can help you to get a more formal or cared for look to your areas of native landscaping. So for example, using distinct edges, mowed paths through natural areas, placing seats or garden sculpture, using larger groups of one species for impact and structure, and repeating patterns, colors and combinations of plants, and the uses of plant labels and signs. Also techniques such as cutting back taller perennials, such as monarda and goldenrods in early summer for shorter stature, and then cutting some earlier blooming species back after flowering to promote fresh growth, can also be really effective for a slightly more formal look. So we have and are currently in the process of putting more information and resources on these topics up on the INPS website. And there is an excellent presentation on the INPS YouTube channel called Beauty and the Beasties, Landscaping 101 for a Wildlife-Friendly Garden by Sarah Gray, which goes into some great detail on landscape design with natives. Additionally, incorporating the latest scientific research into planting plans wherever possible can be really effective for increasing the ecological value of your plantings. So for example, a University of Kentucky study indicated that the layout of gardens strongly influences the extent to which milkweed plants are found and used by monarchs. So the study found that monarch eggs and larvae were more abundant in experimental gardens where milkweed was evenly spaced in a corridor around the perimeter, surrounding the nectar plants and grasses, than in gardens in which milkweeds were surrounded by or intermixed with the other plants. Additionally, significantly more eggs and larvae were found in monarch way station gardens where milkweeds were spatially isolated as opposed to closely intermixed, and in gardens having north-south access unimpeded by structures. So hopefully, if we can incorporate the results of these and other studies into our landscaping decisions, we can really maximize our contribution to conservation. And then there's a question of, do you have to have entirely native plants, or can you have introduced plants as well? And so you certainly don't want any plants that are invasive, and the best way to ensure that you don't have any plants that might become invasive is to have natives. But no, you don't have to have only native plants. Apart from, of course, avoiding invasive plants, it seems really the absence of native plants rather than the presence of non-native plants that's the real concern. So recent research suggests that at a minimum, you really want at least 70% native plants. Research seems to indicate that 70% of native plant biomass is a threshold level below which the probability of sustaining some local bird populations plummets pretty much to zero. So having more than 70% native plant biomass is your target. But another consideration, which is possibly more controversial in some circles, is the use of cultivars or nativars. So wherever possible, due to differences in their impact on ecosystem services, biodiversity and gene flow, straight native species really are a safer option than their often more widely available nativars. So for example, with coneflowers, Echinacea purpurea white swan or something like that is a cultivar or nativar, while the straight native species would be Echinacea purpurea. So variation in how nativars are produced and the traits selected for make this a slightly complicated issue, but as a general rule, from an ecological perspective, the use of straight native species really is preferable to the use of nativars. And while nativars might be attractive for some gardeners, for aesthetic reasons, they can have ecological costs. There are potential impacts on the ecosystems that the native plant communities support, and sometimes on the wild native plant populations themselves. So they can have impacts on ecosystem services and biodiversity. So many have been selected primarily for ornamental traits, and research indicates that not all nativars are ecologically equivalent substitutes for the straight natives. So the ecological roles can be altered by selection for flower size, abundance, color, shape, or phenology, which can all affect the quantity, quality, or accessibility of pollen and nectar. Also, selection for traits such as leaf color can alter plant chemistry, making the plant unrecognizable to a host or deterring herbivory. And then even where the trait being selected for might not appear to us to be ecologically significant, we're still learning about the cues that may be important for wildlife. So for example, a June 2020 paper indicates that hummingbirds can discriminate non-spectral colors, including UV, and that these are likely vital in their foraging. And additionally, hybridization might uncouple trait combinations that influence pollinator foraging. And then there is the potential for genetic pollution and the lack of genetic variation. So for fragile native plant populations, both of these are a concern. So unintended hybridization can lead to gene flow from nativars into wild populations, as well as potentially affecting ecosystem services. This can affect native population survival and contribute to species extinction. Where nativars have been selected for vigor, hybridization is also concerning and might affect competitive interactions and community structure. And then additionally, many nativars are propagated clonally and so have no genetic variation. So genetic diversity found within native plant populations is critical for their adaptability and ongoing evolution. Open pollinated or seed-grown selections of nativars or of natives are preferable to nativars produced vegetatively, but information on their provenance is not always easily available. So I know this is not necessarily a popular opinion, especially among gardeners, and there are exceptions, such as where nativars have been bred for disease resistance. But from an ecological point of view, straight native species really are a safer option. And then another aspect that should be carefully considered is provenance of the seeds and plants used. So neonicotinoids or neonics are a particularly prevalent class of insecticides, and they are very concerning. Some commercial nurseries, big box stores, and seed suppliers routinely treat the plants and seeds that they sell with neonics. So residue levels on ornamental plants have been found to far exceed lethal concentrations for honeybees and for bumblebees, while research also indicates that neonics can lead to changes in foraging behavior, reduce predator avoidance, delay development, reduce reproduction, even at very low residue levels. These systemic insecticides can impact many benign and beneficial insects and have impacts throughout the trophic levels. So a 2017 study found that neonics can dramatically reduce egg laying by queen bumblebees, which were 26% less likely to lay eggs after being exposed to it. And because they're systemic, they're absorbed into the plant. So it means they can be present in pollen and nectar, making them toxic to the pollinators that feed on them. So the potentially long-lasting presence of neonics in plants makes it possible for these chemicals to harm pollinators even when the initial application is made months before the bloom period. So wherever possible, please source seeds and plants that have not been treated with neonics. And also, I would really encourage you to use your buying power to influence the supply chain, asking in local garden centres and bigger box stores for natives, and asking about neonics and provenance can help to influence their buying decisions. So please do ask if the plants or seeds have been treated. And again, the Xerces Society have excellent, very detailed information on this topic. So that's a lot of information, but once you have removed your invasives, reduced your lawn size, chosen which native species to plant and sourced them neonic free, the next concept is ecological landscape management. And there are some really simple things that you can do to ensure that your landscape maintenance is more sustainable. So for example, with mowing, reduce mowing and leave plants intact over winter. So if you wait as long as possible in the spring to do the first mowing, so to avoid killing the caterpillars and other overwintering creatures that are just emerging or yet to emerge. So quite a few people now do no mow May, which is a great idea. And then if possible, to change to a less frequent mowing regime or to leave no mow zones. That is excellent. When you do need to mow, if you set mow heights as high as possible, so ideally no lower than 3 inches and preferably 4 inches or higher. And avoid mowing in the evenings to reduce wildlife mortality and reduce water consumption. When mowing, if you start in the middle of an area, especially a larger area, and move out, giving wildlife a chance to escape, and even setting the mower or other power tools going for just a few minutes prior to use to give warning and allowing them time to flee. And then leaving plants intact over winter can provide food, overwintering habitat and nest sites. And the excellent advice from Heather Home is in spring to cut back at varying heights. So kind of 6, 12, and 24 inches. And as you do that, you're creating sites for the bees to move into as they emerge from the ground. So some of these bees come out of hibernation quite late. So leaving some of the plants fully intact until the end of April or early May will create habitat for these bees too. And then just leave those to decompose. Those stems that you leave for nest should be left up all the way through that year and not moved until late the following spring, or if possible, just left alone. And then create caterpillar pupation sites under your trees. And so more than 90% of the caterpillars do not pupate on their host plants. Most drop to the ground to find pupation sites in leaf litter or under the soil. And so where the area under trees is compacted, mortality can be really high. So planting areas under your trees with ground cover and leaving them with fallen leaf cover, and where possible, fallen logs or logs that have been left to rot is a really great idea. Fallen leaves not only act as an excellent mulch, they also provide overwintering habitat for many insects. So leaving leaf litter on your beds and around trees can have a significant impact. In addition to reducing carbon emissions from leaf blowers and saving money on purchased mulch. And there is, again, wonderful information at the Xerxes Society, their Leave the Leaves campaign. And this sign I just recently got for my yard from the Missouri Prairie Foundation to try and explain to my neighbors that I am intentionally leaving my leaves. And then the next main issue, but perhaps the easiest to change, is lighting. So one of the biggest sources of insect decline is light pollution. So if possible, outdoor lights should be replaced with yellow LED bulbs. Motion sensors can be used to reduce moth mortality and reduce your carbon footprint. And where possible, shades can be fitted that direct the light down. So this is both increases the effectiveness of the lighting and also reduces the impact on insects. And then other small steps that can make quite a big difference are installing window well covers to prevent small creatures from becoming trapped, installing water features with bubblers for wildlife, and instead of large bee hotels, using smaller bee houses or leaving logs and stems intact and in situ. And then last, but very definitely not least, in ecological landscape management, is avoiding or at least reducing chemical use, and particularly pesticide use. So this is in itself a very big topic, so one that I'm not going to go into in a great amount of detail, but there are a few really key points. So pesticide use is really contrary to everything we're trying to achieve. Certainly any prophylactic use should really be avoided, and please consider alternative methods first if you are considering using pesticides. We've already talked a little bit about neonics, but pyrethroid pesticides, which are widely used in mosquito control, are also a really big concern. Mosquito fogging kills insects indiscriminately, and the pyrethroid pesticides typically used can be highly toxic to bees. So research indicates that some pyrethroid insecticides can have toxic effects in humans as well, affecting fertility, immunity, cardiovascular system, hepatic metabolism, and enzymatic activity. So as a safer, cheaper, and more effective alternative, Dr. Talmy advocates the use of mosquito dunks, which are commercially available tablets containing larvicide. Also, frequent disposal of even small amounts of standing water can be very effective for mosquito management, especially on smaller properties. And additionally, native planting around pond edges provides habitat for natural predators of mosquitoes and mosquito larvae, and greatly helps to reduce mosquito populations. So if you are considering using pesticides, it's worth remembering that evidence of herbivory indicates that a plant is actually contributing to the ecosystem and should be welcomed. It doesn't indicate the need for insecticide use necessarily. In a stable ecosystem with sufficient biodiversity, insect levels are kept largely in check by natural predators and parasitoids, and many of the birds that are such a welcome sight in our gardens. So alternatives to pesticides, such as companion planting and physical removal of non-native insects, can be really effective. It's also worth knowing that pesticide syndrome can occur with pesticide use. And this is where unnecessary pesticide use can lead to pesticide resistance and the elimination of natural predators, leading to a cycle of increased need for and reliance on pesticides. So there are really lots of reasons not to use them at all. And then with fertilizers, it's worth knowing that it really is unnecessary in most areas of native plantings, and high nitrogen soils might actually favor non-native and invasive species. So given the pollution associated with fertilizer runoff into waterways, in addition to purchase and application costs, fertilizer use should be avoided as much as possible. So, once you've decided to use native plants and that you're interested in pulling together all of this information, hopefully one of your first stops online might be the INPS website, which is excellently put together and maintained by Wendy Ford. So we have a really talented and exciting Landscaping with Natives team. I think a couple of members might be on the call this evening. I know Brooke is one of them, and we're incredibly grateful to all of them for their work. So we are partnering with the Indiana Wildlife Federation and with Purdue Extension and building on the Homegrown National Park concept as a platform to provide accessible, comprehensive information to guide gardeners, HOA groups, and municipalities so that they can successfully incorporate native plants into a wide variety of urban, suburban, and rural landscapes. We are currently in the process of developing some great material along this framework. Some is already online, and we hope to have the other parts rolled out by the new year. So I'd encourage you to check back often at our website and see what we've added. These are the things that we are currently working on. And all of this material will be freely available to use and share. And any questions or feedback would be gladly received. We're really excited to be developing this material, and we would love your feedback. It's truly a group effort, and we would welcome all of your expertise and input. And then just going to highlight a couple of things that the team have been working on, where there are opportunities that we would really welcome your involvement. So firstly, Bill Daniels has set up an excellent pilot project. It's the Indiana Native Seed Communities. This is a network of native plant enthusiasts working together to collect, prepare, and propagate Indiana provenance seeds to increase the presence of ecologically appropriate native plants in all our landscapes. So this is a joint project of INPS Landscaping with Natives team and Purdue Extension Master Gardeners. It is currently being piloted in the South Central chapter, but there is a public Facebook group which everyone is welcome to join. And we would love your contributions to that group. There's a link to that from our website, or you can contact Bill on that email. We're very much hoping that we'll be able to extend this project out to other chapters very soon. So we would love your feedback and your participation on that. We're also very excited to share about a partnership between the Eiteljorg Museum, the INPS, Purdue Extension Marion County Master Gardeners, and in the Indiana Wildlife Federation with support from Native Plants Unlimited. So the landscaping team are excited to be able to showcase the potential for landscaping with native plants at this very visible central downtown location. Given the Ecological Museum's mission, the link to using native plants in their landscaping seems ideal. And additionally, it's a wonderful opportunity to meet some of the INPS diversity, equity, inclusion and justice goals, and to share education and messaging about the importance of native plants and INPS to a much broader audience. So this is a multi-phase, multi-year project, but we're very excited that the first 2 big planting areas are now pretty much complete. The Deer Fountain area was planted in spring this year, and the prairie at the front of the building just planted earlier this month. We were so thankful to be able to draw on the wonderful expertise and commitment of the team. So in particular, Wendy Ford, Sarah Gray, Brooke Alford, and Mary Durkin, with additional input from Caitlin Osborne and Erin Stump. And we were able to design, source, and plant the area with an amazingly short time frame. So first, I'd like to thank all of the INPS members and master gardeners who donated time and plants and expertise to make this possible. And if you might be interested to be involved, there are sign-up opportunities for maintenance of these areas. We are also hoping to work on a 3rd phase next year, and this phase will further incorporate Indigenous and ethnobotanical uses of native plants within the landscaping. And the Ecological are very keen to explore an interpretive and educational aspect. So if you have any interest or expertise in this area, please do feel free to reach out to us. And then finally, maybe start the conversation with friends and neighbors about who a garden is really for. So we need a big cultural shift in our thinking about gardening, so that as a society, we see gardens not just for people, where the primary focus is often on aesthetics or fashion, but we consider them more in terms of ecosystem function. And the key will be to try to make this way of gardening part of our culture and try to make it acceptable to people who view gardens in a very different light. To try to make native plants and functioning ecosystems something that people can see as a thing of beauty, which they certainly can be, is an exciting challenge. So hopefully our landscapes can be beautiful, functioning, living ecosystems that contribute to the well-being of all the life that shares them. So thank you for your time, and I'm very excited that you might be keen to create your own wildlife habitat. And again, we welcome all of your expertise, and we'd gladly have any input or feedback on any of these plans. I will stop sharing now. And
great, thank you, Coralie. That was fabulous. So much great information. There's so many things that you shared I would love to reiterate. One of them is that we tend to think, when it comes to planting for pollinators and wildlife, we tend to think a lot about grasses and forbs, about, flowers. And I love that you include trees and shrubs. They're so integral to our native landscape, and they provide so much habitat too, not only for pollinators, of course, but other wildlife. So that and so many things just really drive home so importantly in your presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, thanks. And I think, yeah, Heather Home, I wish I had this statistic. She had a fantastic statistic, and it was about the value of a black cherry tree, and a mature black cherry tree can provide the same habitat in terms of area as very large kind of square footage of horizontal planting. And I wish I had it was in a talk that she gave, and I couldn't find the statistic, but I will listen to her again and try and get it. It was a startling amount of area that a mature tree provides,
which is so amazing. And even without the exact numbers, if you just think that you are providing like exponentially the amount of habitat with the tree versus grasses and forbs. And that is especially important when it comes to our urbanized communities, because you know, we're becoming denser and denser, right? And so our square footage on the ground is getting smaller and smaller and smaller for properties. But if we
Yeah.
can use that vertical space, we can provide so much more. So, yeah, it's so important. And I know KIB works a lot on on reclaiming our urban forest canopy. But residential properties are so important for that. They
Right.
really are.
I think with as well as that, I think with the maintenance, and sometimes I know we're we're working to try and help people realize that, you know, native plants can have any aesthetic when planted, but they do require, the perennials can require maintenance, and they can look not your traditional, you know, it's not always your traditional aesthetic, and that can be hard for some people to embrace. So, you know, a native tree or a shrub is often easier to slot into an existing landscape without changing the aesthetic too much. So
And that's such an important remark as well. I mean, the low maintenance is so important to so many people. You know, homeowners and renters who are gardening in their landscape. That low maintenance factor is so key. And understanding that shrubs and trees so much less maintenance than a perennial garden. I mean, I love my perennial garden, but I have to confess, it totally got away from me this past year and really 2 years. And where I've planted kind of thicket hedges in the back, it's just so much easier. I've got like elderberry and dogwood shrubs, and it's easier. And I know that elderberries and dogwoods just feed so many critters, so I'm happy to have them, and they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. So
that sounds wonderful. It sounds really beautiful.
yeah, it's fun. And you know, something that I remember having conversations and reading about in the past is how we've lost thickets. We used to have so many thickets throughout our country and probably across the world. And we don't have as many of those anymore. And so looking at opportunities for planting thickets and corridors for wildlife through thickets and whatnot, I think is exciting as well. Just the possibilities there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That definitely would be incredibly valuable. And those corridors are, yeah, are critical. So
Yeah, I like to think about our residential developments as potential savannas with mixes of trees and shrubs and of course forbs and grasses. I think that there's so much opportunity there for wildlife, but also for people. When you think about the experience of a savanna and, you know, the coming in and out of shade under native trees, and just like the I can't think of the word for it right now, but it's like really from kind of the hard surface of urbanization, and just study after study that shows like the mental benefits of nature and that sort of thing. So I'm getting us a bit off a topic. I apologize, but it was just really inspiring, your conversation, your presentation today. So thank you. We do have a few questions. So if you don't mind, I'd like to get into those. And a little time check here. It's almost 8 o'clock. Somebody asked early on, and I didn't catch it in time. I'm not sure where it was, but you mentioned a website for pollinators specifically. Was that the Xerces Society?
So there's both the Xerces Society and also Heather Holmes, which is pollinatorsnativeplants.com. And so she has a lot of information on pollinators. So that and the Xerces Society are the two that have a lot of really good information.
Okay, I just put Heather Holmes' name in the chat just for everybody so that you have it there. A quick Google search will provide a lot of information from her. And then I'll put Xerces right now also. I never know if I'm saying it right, but
so Heather Holmes has she has downloadable, really excellent downloadable species lists for what will support kind of various different pollinators for different areas and for the different regions. So they're not specifically Indiana, but they're Midwest region. And those are free to download from her website.
That's great. That's great. And I want to mention also the INPS resources that your Landscaping with Natives is producing. I want people to understand that, you know, these are free resources that often people will pay for in books and publications. And they're just such a wealth of great knowledge. That team, I was so just impressed when I got to meet with that team of very creative and experienced designers and ecologists. I'm just so impressed. And so know that these are valuable resources, but they're also really accessible resources. They're not real dense. They're very concise, and I actually hadn't seen yet the search engine that you presented with IWF and INPS. That's amazing, to be able to search by habitat qualities and stuff, such as, you know, light and water and whatnot. That's incredibly powerful.
We're really excited, and I have to thank, I think Aaron Stump might be on the call, but if he is, I have to give him a big thank you, because he has done the majority of the legwork to get that up and running. And yeah, it was Ellen and Wendy who had just such a huge amount of data that they were willing to share freely and let people use, that made that possible. So yeah, I'm really excited about that, and it saves having to go and, you know, double check everything on range maps when you have to go back and forth to see if it actually is native to Indiana, or, you know, and it's all been done. So it's a really great resource, and I know Aaron has done a ton to get the photographs uploaded, but I know he's still working, but it's a really great resource. It's becoming my go-to for my landscaping.
Yeah, that is great. Aaron, thank you so much for your work on that. I think he is still on here with us. And yeah, that's just such an amazing resource. We're really fortunate to have that. Coralie entered in the chat a website for pollinators and native plants.
That's Heather Holmes' website.
Heather Holmes. Okay, great. Great. Thank you for adding that. Let's see. I know we had some more questions. So Jamie did ask about the resource sheet again, and, you know, I'll just, for good measure, I can go ahead and add my email address again in the chat. I'm sorry, I did not realize that I could not add an attachment to Eventbrite email lists. So that was the plan, but it fell through. But please email me at my Purdue address, and I'll share that with you. For those of you who don't know, I wear a couple hats in this work that I do. I am the current president of the Central Chapter of Indiana Native Plant Society, but I'm also an urban ag educator for Purdue Extension and Ag and Natural Resources. And Purdue Extension, one of the goals and or priorities in our ag and natural resources is to support the work of the Native Plant Society. So we're always happy to do that as much as possible. And we're so thankful to people like Coralie. Okay, we have more questions. Let's see. Alina asks, would you recommend using cultivars in landscapes, especially disease-resistant cultivars? Do they have the same ecological value? I think that you touched on that, but I think it would be good. Disclaimer, there are many different opinions on this, but Coralie, it's important. I would really like to hear a little bit more, even though you did touch on it. It's a big topic. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So yes, it is a very nuanced subject, and I know people have a lot of views on it. As a general rule, I do not recommend using cultivars in landscapes. There are potential ecological costs associated with some of them, and it can be difficult to know that unless you're really prepared to do your research about each individual one that you're using. There are some instances, I know you mentioned disease resistance, so dogwoods, there have been cultivars produced or nativars produced with resistance to dogwood anthracnose. And I believe that they were produced from a wild plant that was found that was resistant, and then that has been bred on. And so in cases like that, yes, there can be good reasons for using them. And in that case, it was a wild found kind of cultivar or native variant really that was then bred to because it had disease resistance. And so that has a lot fewer potential ecological costs. You're not, it still has genetic variation. Yes, you're not messing around with too many things. But really, for a number of reasons, partly because the potential for genetic pollution is there with cultivars. The lack of genetic variation, if they're produced vegetatively, is a big concern, especially with changing climate and pressures on fragile populations, as they need, our native plant populations need to have genetic variation in order to enable to let them adapt to these changing conditions. And without that genetic variation, they won't be able to. And then also, changing the value of those native plants for the wildlife that depends on them. So changing their phenology or their flowering or their leaf chemistry. And we're not, because sometimes these traits are coupled at the genetic level, we don't always know what the impact is of that. We might think we're just changing flower color, but we don't know that we're also changing other things that are linked, and we don't know how important that flower color is. And like I think I mentioned with them, hummingbirds using UV and non-spectral colors, that's only been found out in this last year. We had no idea that they were using those colors as cues for foraging, and so we might think that we're just changing it from red to blue or whatever, but we're not always aware of the changes in cultivars. So no, as a general rule, safer to use the straight species, but there are times when yes, if you're prepared to do the research, or if there's disease involved, that definitely there are.
Yeah. Hey, could we ask, I'd like to ask just for a little bit of clarification, because propagation methods, where Coralie, you and I are, so versed in it, is just to clarify, vegetative propagation is when you're taking one single plant, like, so envision I do a lot of dividing in my garden because I like to make more plants with the plants that I have. So essentially, you're taking one plant that has the genetics of two parent plants, maybe, and you're just making more plants from that. So it's a very limited genetic pool. But when you're taking what I think is called a sport from nature, where a species has produced a particular version, I think, from that's genetically unique or characteristically unique, that's going to have more of the genetic variation because it was naturally reproduced in nature. Is that correct, Coralie?
So it's kind of complicated. Yeah, it kind of then depends what you go on and do with them. So where you're dividing or produce or propagating vegetatively, you're effectively making a clone. There's no genetic variation then between, that plant will have genetic variation, but then all of those that you divide from it, or that population will then all be very similar genetically. They won't have any variation. And yes, with the variants that they find naturally, it then depends what they then go on and do. So whether they're produced vegetatively or whether they're allowed to open, cross-pollinate with others and reproduce. So it gets kind of, and plants can do strange things with their diploidy, so they can it gets kind of, it's not as straightforward as in humans where we have kind of two sets. They can suddenly get 3 or 4 multiply their ploidy. So it gets a little complicated. Yes, as a general rule, if a plant, so in nativars or cultivars that are allowed are produced from open pollination, will have more genetic variety than those that have been produced vegetatively. But it is very hard to find out that information from the growers. So
it's not normally occurring on a label as a.
No, you don't always know what how that plant has been produced.
Sure.
Yeah, so open pollination is better. And with the cultivars, just to touch back on that, there are a number of studies ongoing. There's a big study, I believe it's still going on. I know it was started last year, and I think it's still going on at the Chicago Botanic Garden, looking at the ecological value of a number of nativars. And there's also, Dr. White, Annie White, who I believe, I think she might be University of Vermont. She has got some great research. I think it's in the list that I gave you, but she has done some really good research on the value of nativars and cultivars and the potential ecological costs. So there isn't a huge amount of data. There are studies going on, and that will be really useful to have that data. But I think until we do, erring on the side of caution is the safest way to go.
Mm-hmm. I know that over a year and a half ago, pre-pandemic, time is relative these days, I listened to a podcast with Dr. Doug Talamy, and he was talking about some of his research with some of his graduate students around ecological or habitat value of nativars. And they were starting to kind of really drill down to specific characteristics that did or did not seem to affect habitat value. And it had to do with leaf color and variegation and that sort of thing. It's been a while, so I can't remember it exactly. If you want to Google podcast Doug Talamy and nativars, you could probably find it if one was interested.
Right. Yeah, no, that would be interesting. And I'd be interested to hear his views and whether that's changed or not. So I know I believe he's on the board of Wild Ones, and they just released a statement earlier maybe just a couple months ago. They just released like a public statement on the use of nativars, which I don't know that is actually on the resource list because it came out quite recently. But that is effectively saying the same things we've been saying, that just, caution, use with caution, and ideally not. So I know he is on the board of that, I believe, and I think Heather Holm is as well on the board of that organization. So I expect they had some hand in crafting that statement.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I have liked that I have heard from various people in the field is consider like a ratio, like maybe 70% pure species to 30% nativars, something like that, so that you maybe can get a little bit of benefit from that, I guess, the structure desired from the plants, but still get more so the habitat.
And I think that could certainly be an option. My only proviso with that would maybe be to just being aware of potential genetic pollution between the two, or genetic interaction between the straight native species and the nativars if you have the same species. So maybe, yeah, maybe just being aware and cautious that you might not want to have a closely related nativar. If you have a true straight species, you don't want them to running through, because that can change. It can change competitive interactions in the community. It can, yeah, that way you can get some of the altered traits can be brought into the straight natural populations, and that can be a concern, I think.
Sure. So are you saying like don't have a nativar and a straight species of the same species? Is that what you're suggesting? Because that's what can make the genetic pollution?
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
and again, we don't have a ton of data on this, but that would be a concern for sure. So
Okay.
you wouldn't want them, you certainly wouldn't want them really close together. So for example, like with Ecological combine, they can, I don't put the straight native species. I don't actually have any cultivars or nativars, but there are a lot of them, and I don't put I wouldn't put those anywhere close to the straight native because of that potential for interbreeding. I would want to keep them really separate. And then the other thing is with the aesthetic and getting aesthetic, I think looking at some of the horticultural techniques for achieving that. So like, cutting some of the taller plants back really quite late in the year to give you that shorter stature, and things like that can be really effective for maintaining a look that you want, but not, you can still have the straight native species, but you can manage them in a way that means that they're maybe not 5 foot tall.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. The intentional maintenance strategies to get the look that an individual, and it is individual. I let my garden just go wild, and I'm happy with that. But people live in HOAs, and it doesn't necessarily fly as well in the front yard of an HOA. So I think that's really important, that just the maintenance strategies you can use to keep it a little more controlled for good neighbor relations.
Yeah, and that's something that we don't currently have we don't have those resources on our website, but it's something I would really like to build and to get on our website. Is some more information for people on that, and I think a lot of the very keen gardeners have a lot of that knowledge that I would love to tap into.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, I'll be waiting for that resource, because that'll be great. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. Judy asks, where does one start to eliminate grass lawn, especially when it involves some invasive clover, nettle, etc.?
Right. So Brooke, you actually probably have much more experience on preparation of site than I do. I know you were amazing at that with the Ecological Museum at the site preparation. So I might hand that over to you if that's.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it. And it always, as with all of this work, it depends on one's personal kind of guiding principles in landscaping. I think Coralie, we agree that herbicide use is necessary in certain controlled environments when we have invasive plants that otherwise cannot be eliminated. So my nemesis currently is Canadian thistle, and I will be treating that with a glyphosate topically, not even cut and treat, but topically, because otherwise, if I don't, it will outcompete every other species in my garden out front. So for the most invasive, such as Canadian thistle, I do recommend some herbicide use using all of the best protocol for safety, both environmental and personal safety. But uh, other so we have things like you have sod removal machines, and you'll see pictures out there that make it look really easy, like you just walk behind a machine and boom, it just rolls up your sod and then you can plant. And having been one to use this time and time again, it's not that easy. And so I like to look towards kind of more passive. They take a little bit longer, but strategies like sheet mulching, which is just putting down cardboard and then arborist chips on top, that just smothers the turf underneath. And then you're ready to plant into it, you know, in 6 months to a year. I have even used it where I plant into it sooner and I just dig out the grass and weeds that are in the planting hole of the plant that I'm planting. So sheet mulching is one option. Lasagna gardening is another option that some people have used. I don't know that it's needed as much with native planting because it includes natural amendments such as coffee grounds, brewery waste, things that naturally have high nitrogen. I have learned from experience that you don't need to feed your native plants when you put them in, because I have, and believe me, boom, they took off. And so really the sheet mulching is my favorite technique for reducing turf, between cardboard or other paper products and free arborist chips that we don't want going to a landfill. We do not want arborist chips going to a landfill. We want them to be used. Those are my favorite techniques. So Alina, I hope that that helps you. Again, clover, smother it with sheet mulching. I'm not sure about nettle. I haven't worked with that. I know in the case of Canadian thistle, I would treat it because those rhizomes are going to persist under almost anything and they'll be back. So yeah, I hope hopefully that's helpful. That's yeah, that's good fun. Reducing turf. I've spent a lot of my life doing it and I love it. Okay. Another question for you. Let's move on. Is it known how long neonics remain in a plant after treating with the neonic?
So I don't know exactly. I know it can be months. It can be months between when it's being applied and when it's still there at levels that it really can be toxic. Again, actually, the Xerces Society does have they have some really excellent resources on neonics,
Okay.
and especially their impact on bees, which is, I'm sure they're very toxic to other insects also, but the impact on bees have been more widely studied, I think. And yeah, so that is, and I'm guessing it probably depends on the exact neonic there. It's a large class of different compounds.
Oh, okay.
There are different ones and they have different levels of toxicity. But yes, they are systemic, so they'll be present in every part of the plant and they can remain for months on end. So
yeah. Yeah, very impactful. Okay. What is a prophylactic chemical?
So that is one that you would apply when there isn't a problem. You're just trying to prevent there being a problem. So it's not to treat, as you know, it's not treating a problem. It's anticipating a problem and treating it beforehand. So we definitely do not want to use pesticides in that way. You know, if that is extremely damaging.
I understand. So that's probably like some of these big lawn care companies that just like across the board treat all of this turf across the.
Yeah, whether there's a problem or not. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's the same, it's kind of the same problem that we've seen with antibiotics in livestock farming, where they use them not to treat an infection, they just use them to prevent there becoming an infection, but then you get resistance, and it's that same kind of thing. Yeah, prophylactic chemical use should, pesticide use should absolutely not be used in any circumstance.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
So there was a pesticide that you mentioned. What is the pesticide that Talamy recommended? And I'm not, do you remember?
So
Not around mosquitoes or?
yeah, so it was the larvicide. So it's called a mosquito dunk, and it's not actually a, well, it's a bacteria that it's bacillus, and I'm going to mess up on what species of bacteria it is, but it's basically it's a tablet. I've never used them, but Dr. Talamy does recommend them. It's basically, you can buy them in tablet form, and you put them into water, to standing water, and it will kill, it's a bacterial infection, I believe, that will kill mosquito larvae. So it is not chemical. And that is, and I think it's just called mosquito dunk. I think the mosquito dunks, I think you can buy them fairly, fairly widely. And so that is his recommendation for, and apparently much more effective because it's killing at the larval stage, rather than the sprays which try and, fogging, which is trying to kill them at the adult stage, and just kills indiscriminately every insect in that area. So this is very targeted. It will just get those, it will just kill those larvae. Yeah. I have not used them, but it's his recommended method.
Right. I know that I mentioned earlier, I'm an urban ag educator with Purdue Extension, and it's incredible the amount of crop pests we have here in the Midwest. It's been a true learning curve for me, understanding that, and looking at providing pollinator gardens to provide native warriors to these non-native pests. A lot of them do seem to go after the insect in the larval stage, which I found really, really interesting. And again, Heather Holmes has great resources about that as well. So, using, our native nature, native plants, and native insects to combat the non-native is something that I have found really interesting and effective. So yeah, again, Heather Holmes has great resources on that as well.
Great. Yeah. We need Sarah Gray on this. This is her area of expertise. She has a lot of really good knowledge of entomology and
oh, cool. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I'll have to pick her brain. Back in the country yet?
I'm not sure. Actually.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay, back on topic. I think we've gotten through all the questions that have been posted so far. So I want to do just a last call for questions, either in the chat or feel free to unmute and, to video up. Any final questions for Coralie before we let her go for the evening? And I do appreciate the questions that have been shared so far. They've been really good.
Thank you. Really good question.
Okay, well, hearing none, and it is 3 minutes until 8:30, so we need to let everybody get about their evening now. Coralie, thank you so much for your time this evening and all of the wonderful information you shared. And for that resource sheet, people, please do copy my address from the chat, my email address, and email me for that resource sheet. It's very comprehensive. So I thank you for that, Coralie, and for all you do for our native plant communities.
You do so much. So it's been really fun working with you on this. Yeah,
well, you as well. Okay, well, everybody have a great evening. Again, come look for us in November, where we'll be talking about traditional uses of indigenous plants. And yeah. All right. Thank you, Coralie. Again, hit me up at my email. Anybody interested in the Idlejord project, if you want to volunteer there, or if you have any more questions about our programming, just let me know. Okay, until next time. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.